An original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, welcome in. Here we go. It is the 5th day of April 2024 as we record this. It is Now and Next. I'm Dave Trafford. This is the flagship podcast for Story Studio Network. And good of you to be here. And I think you're going to, well, it just so happens that we're recording this on a very significant political date. We'll get into that in a minute. We just wrapped up recording of On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast, which we drop on Fridays. Should be in your podcast app right now as we speak. And I just gave you a hint. Look around you and tell me how $420 billion in spending at Queen's Park has changed your life since last year at this time. Now, about half or more than half is soon-come money. But that number comes from the last two budgets tabled by Doug Ford's Conservatives at Queen's Park. Record spending. So, question of the day, considering everything that's going on, how has that improved your life? Are you better off today? Do you expect to be better off a year from now? Thanks to nearly $500 billion in promised spending at Queen's Park alone. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Keith Leslie, John Wright, and I survey the entrails on that post-budget. It's all about big money and big spending at the park. So, Ontario Politics is your jam. Go and check it out. Today on the Ledge. Today, Now and Next, I get my podcast straight. We are 7 months from the election day in the United States. And the outcome, without being overly dramatic, the outcome of that vote to come may well prove to be the most significant since Abraham Lincoln was elected with less than 40% of the popular vote in 1860. Those of you who follow American politics will know Lincoln's election is cited as the primary cause that triggered the U.S. Civil War. So, with that in mind, we ask the question, will the United States be a safer place if Donald Trump wins or if he loses? So in this episode of Now and Next, we are joined by veteran pollster John Wright, Senior Vice President of Maru Public Opinion. And, of course, he happens to be a co-host on The Ledge. John and I have known each other and been associates for a number of years now. And he has all the insights it would take to kind of, go through the numbers, take the pulse based on his experience. And David Schultz also joins us. David is the professor of political science and constitutional law at Hamline University in Minnesota. He is a regular voice and contributor here on this show. And so we explore the political landscape, particularly focusing on what appears to be a dissonance between the political narrative out there and the state of the economy. And we begin with some polling and some research that John Wright has done specifically focused on the United States.
My first polls in the United States were actually with CNN in 1992. So I go way back in there. I did the Associated Press polling for about 5 years and then switched into Reuters, which I did not only their American, but also their international stuff. So I've had a fair bit of pulse taking there in the United States, and I see it as a Canadian having done work up in Canada. And, the first thing you have to remember about everything in the United States is that and Dave Schultz will be able to chime in a bit better than I do for sure, is that ever since the Civil War, there's been this 50-50 divide in the United States. It just seems that no matter what you do, elections are won by either a point up or a point down, or won or lost that way. And when it comes to the economy, it's very similar in terms of how Americans see it. It's very politically aligned. I mean, the economy becomes a proxy for vote. So nowadays, you will find, based on the latest polling, roughly 45% of American Democrats and leaners, independents, will say that, the economy is pretty good, and yet only 13% of Republicans will say that. So you have this big split in terms of how things are being perceived. Having said that, the latest polling I just did effectively finds what we've been looking at since about 2020. The one thing is that Americans are very, very pumped on the economy and everything around it this month. In fact, it's a rare month where you get all of those things which they see as monetary challenges and outlooks and all that stuff actually looking good. It's like right across the board. Of the 16 ingredients I measure, 13 of them are all in the green this month. What is problematic for those on both sides of the border is inflation. If you go back to 2020 and you look to where we are today, it's basically 20% more to purchase that $100 than it was before. So the problem on both sides of the border is really simple. That is that if you get before COVID, things were in one way, but after COVID, even though wages are up, significantly, let's say almost 6% in the United States over the last year or so, the relative impact of inflation makes their impact about 1.4%. So Americans wake up every morning and they see all these great things, but then they say, I can't get ahead. Like, there's not enough money on the table to do what I want to do. And that's a combination now of interest rates, built-in inflation that would be for things like gas. And then the rest of it is kind of left over the last few years, where it's just eaten away 20% of every buying dollar. So that's my read of it. David, you're on the ground there and may see it differently, but it sure seems like that when I look at the numbers here.
Yeah, let me parse it two different ways. First, I think John's fundamentally correct in terms of the polarization, is that we really are just about at a point where we live in the United States in two nations, and I'm not sure if it's separate and equal or separate and unequal, but certainly very different perceptions of how to think about the world. And with that, remember that this election is going to come down to, as I've been arguing it, probably somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 voters. And what I mean by that, there's 5 or 6 swing states that are really going to decide the election. And within those 5 or 6 swing states, again, I'm saying it really comes down to 150 to 200,000 voters. So that's how polarized we are. It's the logic of moving small numbers of people. 1 or 2 percentage points will really do it. But I describe America as having 3 streets: Wall Street, Main Street, and lack of a better name, Elm Street. And Wall Street is doing really well at this point. I mean, the stock market is at record levels. To some extent, Main Street's doing reasonably well, but it's a little rocky, but still not bad. But when we get down to Elm Street, Elm Street being sort of the individual consumer, every time they go to the gas tank or go to the gas station or go to the grocery store, and I hear this all the time, and I see it too, you pick up 2 bags of groceries and you say, oh my gosh, 2 bags of groceries cost, this amount or something like that. And so the perception that is really driven really more about the inflation and by classic pocketbook types of issues. And for political scientists who like to model everything, this quarter, going into this second quarter is critical, because generally, voters' perceptions of the economy, along with approval rating for the president, are pretty good predictors, not guarantors, but pretty good predictors of what happens in elections. And even though all the numbers look pretty good in terms of the economy, it's the inflation factor that's souring a lot of people right now. And this is the problem that Joe Biden faces. So
where's the disconnect? Because at some point, back to John's point, David, that the idea that, everybody's looking at these indicators and, out of the basket of goodies that John asks questions around, all seem to be, even inflation aside, I think I'm doing okay. I feel like there's an acknowledgement that things are on an upward trend. But when we listen to the things that are driving the political narrative on each side of the border, each side of the aisle, the idea is, something is really desperately broken here. We take it to an extreme, and that just kind of amps up this level of outrage, whether it's the Trump camp or, Biden and the Democrats are just as good at outrage as anybody. And that seems to be where the political conversation lives. It's not in the middle there. It's not as nuanced as both of you have just described.
Yeah. Well, I think what's happening here also is that, unfortunately, in the United States, the extremes are driving the agenda. And I describe America on one level as looking like a bimodal curve, that the percentage of the Americans who identify as moderate has gone down. The partisanship has pushed the centers of the two parties further and further apart. Notice I said partisan. But if you look at where people stand on issues, change the rhetoric, there's actually a lot more political consensus. But what's happening is that the partisans, the extremes, are driving the agenda. And what's really happened in the United States now is partisanship triumphs over ideology, partisan triumphs over many other variables. And the way that candidates and parties motivate people now is if I can sort of use the old, what's the fable? The boy who cries wolf or something like that. I'm just trying to think of which the right parable is. Like, keep crying wolf at this point and scaring people into supporting it. So that's the rhetoric that's driving American politics, reinforced by a social media bubbles that the two sides are in.
So, John, when you look at the way that your own sense of their attitudes, generally speaking, are, and you kind of overlay that with the political narrative, what does that say? I mean, generally, is this unusual? I guess is my question for you. Is that, would we have more of a recognition of one lane sort of going in the same direction as the other lane? Here we've got a little bit at odds in terms of the attitudes and our perspective of how things are playing out in the United States.
Well, I mean, Canadians will take their perspectives from their own country. And in our country, we've got effectively 5 political parties. So that splits the vote on a bunch of things. We don't have, as Dave rightly points out, the highest levels of partisanship that you can find. And if one goes back, in the United States, one can find a political consultant named Karl Rove who years ago effectively said, look, the conservative voice in this country is nothing. We've got, there was even one of the very first pieces of work that was done by my old company, Angus Reid, and it surveyed professors in the United States. And it came back and showed that there was a dearth of Democrat-related kind of liberal thinking educators, and that set off alarm bells in conservative circles that said, look, we got to have our own voice. And so what's happened, of course, is that voice has built over time. And Karl Rove may say it wasn't such a great thing now, but at the time it suddenly became a megaphone that started to amp up. So rightly so. If you take a look in the last number of years, the growth of the internet communities and the Twitterary at that time, the growth among conservatives is massive, like just huge compared to others. So, I think the issue is different in Canada, where you don't have the hyper-partisanship and you certainly don't have that because of the party splits and the regionality. But in the United States, you do see two things through my lens. Number one is this hyper-partisanship, which drives everything. But secondly, it's a culture war in the United States. It doesn't surprise me at all that in the last week, Joe Biden has decided with his vice president to go after the Roe v. Wade vote. I mean, that's the countermeasure to the economic piece that's on the other side of the aisle. It just seems that it's not just about the economy. It's about the culture of the United States. Each one of these issues embodies far more than what we would have here in this country. And as I said, that has been around for 100 or more years in some senses, but absolutely amped up in the last decade because of social media.
So given that, David, and I keep hearing, this election is about, preserving and saving democracy. And that sounds great in a headline. That sounds excellent on a fun podcast to do. But seriously, how many people are actually saying, God damn it, I'm going to go out there and vote for democracy?
Very little at this point. The Pew Research Center, which is actually quite good in the United States in terms of their polling and work, they did a recent poll that really asked people what's at the top of their list in terms of things that they care about. And again, it's not a surprise that it's the economy. And we also know that immigration is pretty high up on the list at this point in terms of addressing the southern border issue. But when you actually get to the further down the line about questions about something about preserving democracy or something, it's not there. It's not there. People are voting on, again, the pocketbook issues, and to some extent, some of the issues that they perceive that are important that they see in the news at this point. And at least in the American media, and I can't speak for what's being broadcast up in Canada, the border crisis, the border issues along the southern border really are a recurrent problem in the United States, and it's being exploited by both candidates. The fact that we've not addressed immigration reform in nearly 30, maybe 35 years, and it's really overdue. I think the American public is rightly perceiving that that's a problem that needs to be fixed. And maybe it's accentuated by the hyperpartisanship, but I don't see, outside of a few really hyperpartisan people, them saying that the issue is democracy. Even though personally, I think we probably ought to spend more time worrying about the role of money in politics and a few other things, but this is not what's moving people. It's going to be personality, partisanship, and a couple of issues. Along with, I think, again, John's correct here. I think there's certain percentages of the American public that are also moved by the abortion reproductive rights issue.
Well, and it's funny, as you talk about that list in the Pew surveys, I saw one Gallup, might have been about a week and a half ago. And what was really surprising is that abortion didn't show up in the top 15 or something. Yeah. But to the degree to which both parties have kind of taken up that mantle and decided that is going to be a ballot question. And to be fair, it seems to have driven the midterm elections. So at some point, you get to that point where what exactly is top of mind, and I realize there's methodology that John can speak to around the polling, but it sounds to me, maybe in this campaign more so than ever, David, we're kind of firing darts a little bit in the dark here in terms of if you were a strategist and having to lay out the path to Election Day.
A little bit, but I want to come back to a point that I opened up with, is that, remember, well, I'll describe it this way. 555-270 or 666-270. Either 5% of the voters in 5 counties in 5 states tell us who gets to 270 electoral votes, or 6% of the voters roughly in 6 counties in 6 states. And what I'm getting at here is that what they're trying to throw their darts at, to use the phrase, is what's going to move 150 to 200,000 voters. And this becomes, I think, and John can speak to it, the nightmare for pollsters, because we're now at such a fine granularity of analysis, trying to figure out, dispersed across 5 or 6 states, what 150,000 people may be thinking and what's going to influence their vote. This is an incredibly hard job to be able to calculate in terms of it as a political scientist, because we're looking at 10,000 people here, 15,000 people there in terms of what's moving them. I don't even know how you as a pollster can go at that level of granularity to tap into that.
I think there's a movie, I can't remember the name of it, you probably might, but there's a movie made many years ago where a town is selected to determine where they go out and they find that it's just America Town, and they start polling them. And people look at a product off the shelf and they go, this is really good, and of course then the big advertising agencies take that and they start doing it. It goes across America, and it all works until they find out in that town, that their view is causing the national view of the advertisers and the marketing and everything else. So they start to shift. And the whole point of the movie is that at the end of it, they become irrelevant because they've, they either hold their views or they realize that it is important. And the problem that you get into in this is that years ago, we would have said, Dave and I would have sat in a room and said, you know what, let's stop polling the country and let's just poll 7 or 8 swing states. Let's find out what they do. Well, of course, everybody tries to do that. And of course, people buckle under and say, I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to do. Why should I? I'm not, I'm going to unplug the phone because I get 30 phone calls on this. And now they don't do it by phone. So it's all online. And so they say, I'm not going to do that sort of stuff. The problem with this is exactly as he said. It would be like trying to figure out the national election based on doing all of your polling in Cornwall, Ontario. It's just kind of like, sorry, but that may be a swing part of the country, but no one's going to tell you, months out in advance how they think. The issue for me always in this is everybody likes a horse race, and the horse races are always better when they're bigger numbers. And we'll get down to election night, and at the beginning of the night, you're going to get all of the votes that have been cast that day coming into those swing states, and Trump may say, I've won. And then what's going to happen is you're going to get all those mail-in votes come in over the next couple of days, which will even it out or go one way or the other, to which you'll say, look, they stole it from me. That's now what's going on here, where you have the delay of the actual vote being put into it, and the narrative is effectively hijacked and gone in that other direction. So it's very, very different in the United States because it does come down to those 7 or 8 swing states. And even when you think you've got the vote, you really don't know.
Well, you talk about that town being irrelevant in the long term, John. I would not want to be a pollster within a political campaign, like actually within the campaign, because at that level, they would want to be that granular. And it sounds like their job is becoming more and more difficult as they go in terms of setting the strategy.
Well, I'd be interested in Dave's comment rather than my own, except my experience is this. If you're polling in Ontario right now, you're only looking at between 38 and 40% of the vote, and you really don't give a crap about anybody else.
Right.
And within that 38 to 40% of the vote, you're looking at about 15 points that move one way or the other. And what that means is tailoring your messaging to that group so that you keep them fired up and on your side. So at the end of the day, you're looking at 15% of 40, which is 40 of 100. So it's a very sparse group of people that you can animate and get out, and especially target with Facebook and all that sort of stuff. That's actually how campaigns work. They come down to just, a handful of areas, and they target certain people. And I can't imagine, David, I'd be interested in your view, because I can't imagine being in those swing states 2 years out from an election campaign and being bombarded by all of the social media, the advertising.
Yep.
I mean, you cannot get away from that stuff. It just creates a totally different moronic sense of the world if you're being bombarded by all of this stuff all the time.
There's one of my favorite old cartoons. It's got to be from a zillion years ago, back when pollsters still went door to door. Okay, this is long ago. And a pollster's knocking on a door and yells out to the person in the house, if the election were held today, and the person yells back and says, I would be really grateful. And I love that cartoon. I wish I could find it. I would send it to you, John. But what it speaks to is exactly it. That in those critical swing states, that's where all the visits are going to be. That's where all the money is spent on the advertising. It's an absolute bombardment. But I want to bring up a couple more things here quickly. Is that I can't remember if it was a Harris or a Gallup poll that I saw recently also pointed out, and we've seen several polls that have pointed to the fact that about 65% of the American public does not like Trump versus Biden. But if you parse it more, about 19% equally hate Trump and equally hate Biden, and they're calling them the dual haters. And one of the questions now becomes, where are these dual haters going to go? Are they going to say, I hate Biden more than Trump or Trump more than Biden? In 2016, there were dual haters, and they went what? They abandoned Clinton. They went to Trump. In 2020, they hated Trump more. They went to Biden. We don't know yet for this election where they're going to go in terms of those dual haters. And I think that's pretty critical for us trying to think about this, because these are a lot of individuals who might not make their decisions until the last minute. And this throws one more monkey wrench in that John was hitting at here is that we have, in the last election, I think it was nearly 60% of the voters voted before Election Day. Voting starts as early as 45 days before the November 5th election. And from a candidate's perspective, this becomes a nightmare now. Both, you can nail down voters, but you're having to pitch your message with a rolling audience. Elections in America are no longer running a marathon or a race where you've got a fixed finish line. It's multiple finish lines. And again, for a pollster, you're having to figure out how to poll people who made up their mind in September versus second week of October, third week of October, who are making up their minds in the closing days of the election, and how many of those people are still out there. We've made it, from a campaign strategist point of view, an incredibly complex process for really messaging, I would say.
Yeah, John, it just becomes almost, there's a possibility here. I mean, this might be overstating it, but it's almost a shift month to month as we get closer to the election. And based on this rolling numbers that you have in in terms of the economic outlook, et cetera, the consumer index, that ballot question, as subtle as it may be, could shift just enough one way or the other to make a significant difference in these, various counties that are really going to make the decision.
Yes, and in fact, I think the underlying piece within the last couple of analysis that I've done, that I sent to both of you to take a look at, was I turned to my wife the other night and I said, if the economy starts to get better, who benefits the most from this? And so let's take it from the Canadian view for a moment. Mr. Trudeau is sitting at about 25 to 27% of the vote, which is wipeout territory. And a lot of that started when the Bank of Canada started to hike interest rates because inflation was the way it is. So people are experiencing the same thing on this side of the border and saying, I can't get ahead. It's terrible. The taxes are awful. They do this. What's interesting to me on both sides of the border is that while a lot of people may blame their political leaders at the moment, what's happening is, since about last October, it's starting to tick up in terms of confidence on the economy on both sides. You can actually see it. And the question is, where is it in Canada? Well, right now we've got about 36 to 37% saying the economy is pretty good. Whereas before it was, down in the 20s, basically. Well, when you're in the 20s and the economy is your ballot question, you're going to get slaughtered. But as it moves up, you start to come along a little bit better with it. And this morning we understand, even while we're doing this podcast, that the inflation number came out and shocked many who predicted it would be worse. And it's actually better than the United States is at 2.8% instead of 3.2. So the real player in the last year, I would argue, is not the politicians, but the Bank of Canada, and then the United States is the Fed. I mean, the Fed will be meeting on Thursday, I think it's Wednesday afternoon, to decide what the interest rate is going to be. And this is the betting game. You kind of get your money and throw it down, and you see either a thumb up or a thumb down, and there you go. The issue for me is, if Mr. Trudeau was at 25% in the polls about 6 months ago, and he sees the world as a minority government setting, which means that for him, all he needs to do is get 33. He can rule the country in a minority the same way that he rules it in a majority. He doesn't need 38 to 40%. If that number starts ticking up so that you're now at 36 to 39%, thinking the economy is pretty good, and if the Bank of Canada comes in and actually cuts a rate or two before the end of the year, people start going, you know what, I feel some momentum. I feel better about it. Maybe that's his strategy, that he's going to hang in, and he says, I can pick up another 5 points. I can win again. A lot of that will have to do even in the United States. If the Fed decides that it's going to cut rates in June, which is questionable at the moment, or a little bit later, then Americans start to change their attitude a bit. And it's exactly what Dave has said. And that is that you get about 20% of the vote who hate one way or the other, but the others are slightly different shades of hate. And if you can get some sunlight, for maybe 10% of those people who say, you know what, it's not a bad day today, then that may be what tips you into a winning position. And I think that's going to be the one in the fall where everybody kind of goes in September. Will the Fed cut again? And if they do, who knows how it's going to fall out on Election Day in November.
Yeah, David, you will know this, but my guess is that we have never had an election where we have a president incumbent running against a former president in an election.
The closest we've had, actually, we had to research this. It was in 1912. Teddy Roosevelt decides to run again, challenging, if I remember correctly, it was Taft, if I remember correctly, and Woodrow Wilson.
Okay.
So, and then we had it once before in the 19th century. I think it was Cleveland versus Harrison. But let's say comfortably, we have not seen this in 100 years. And I've been describing this election as full of black swans. Black swans, because we also don't know what's going to play out with 91 indictments, four trials coming out. You're right. We've got the Israeli Hamas war. Who knows where that's going to go at this point, in the next few months. So there's so many, to me, black swans, or in the United States, we call it, because our elections are in November, there's a phrase we have in the United States called October surprises. And I think there are several possible October surprises out there that are really hard to predict. I'm going to give you a really silly one, a totally silly October surprise too. All right. The Taylor Swift phenomena. Is that if Taylor Swift were to come out and endorse Joe Biden and say to her supporters, young females who generally don't vote in high percentages, say, come out, vote for Joe Biden, that could move the election in those 6 swing states. Now, it's a little silly, a little pop culture-ish, but I'm also serious.
Well, I mean, there have been sillier things said about elections that have come true, so you're probably pretty safe territory there, David. The soup that we are creating here between now and Election Day in November is going to be an interesting one, and I say that without being glib, because I think it is. Win or lose, the Trump factor is not going to be, is going to have an effect on everything that happens in the United States over the next term, period. And I think we're going to still feel the effects here on this side of the border in Canada. And you point out, internationally, the crisis that we face in Europe, in the Middle East. All of these things are still very much live and moving forward in a dangerous way. In some respects, you got to wonder whether or not there will be analysis that will be done that will say, is the world a safer place if Trump is elected or if he loses the election?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I can see just, again, already with the rhetoric around the January 6th hostages, all that kind of stuff so far out. Boy, a year from now, we might be, wishing he had won an election if he loses.
Well, but Dave would agree with me. I mean, that's good campaigning. I got to say, I don't, for many people, that's not the right message to hear. But what you do have is somebody who's got rolling average polling that's going on, and they're talking to the Republican base into that 19 or 20%. And what they've done is that they've done the phrasing test. How much does a zinger, does hostage taking actually have? How does it resonate? How does it drive it? So part of this is just how the former president sees the world and spouts out every single night. On the other hand, this is very carefully crafted to make sure that these, it's like a tuning fork. It bings and it goes off. Yep. We started with the economy in this conversation, and it's still, at the end of the day, comes back to James Carville. It's about the economy, stupid, about pocketbooks. The question is whether or not, at the end of the day, the rhetoric on social issues is going to trump versus, didn't mean the pun there, versus, putting meat and potatoes on the table. And that's kind of, I think, where we're going to end up at the end of the day.
John Wright, David Schultz, thanks. This has been fun. We'll have to do it again maybe a couple times before Election Day, just to see where we go. Good of you to join us. Thank you.
Thank you.
All the best.
And yes, there may be some October surprises there. And as goofy as it did sound, and David Schultz was sort of making fun, but not really making fun, the Taylor Swift thing could move the needle. And as goofy as it sounds, that might be the difference in the election. I don't know. But I love how he talked about the black swans. All of these things on the horizon. But still, if you asked somebody 10 years ago, do you think that someone who encouraged people to storm the Capitol the day they were actually deciding, to put the election results to bed, to verify the election, would that individual be fit for office, fit to be the president of the United States? Of course, the answer 10 years ago would have been no. Now, there's a crazy number of people who are willing to put an X beside Donald Trump's name. So, again, without any intention of being hyperbolic or overly dramatic, we ask the question, will the United States be a safer place if Donald Trump wins or if he loses the election in November of this year? Because, he's already talking about the United States will cease to exist if he loses. Scary thought. And should we be paying attention? Absolutely, we should. How do we prepare for it? Well, that's going to be the topic of conversation, I think, over the next coming months as we prepare for Election Day in the United States. Not, as David points out, it's not voting day because they start voting early. The actual Election Day, count the ballot day, is November the 5th, 2024. That'll do it for us for this episode of Now and Next. Thanks for listening. If you would like to share it, by all means, we would encourage you to do so. If you've got a thought on the show, leave us a comment, leave us a rating on the show if you listen on Apple. And if you want to reach out, by all means, you can find me on social media at Dave Trafford. And that'll get me on, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, LinkedIn. What else? Oh, X, Twitter. Just about forgot about that one. Yeah, at Dave Trafford. And let me know. What do you think? There's the question. Will the United States be a safer place if Donald Trump wins or if he loses? Talk to you next week.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Now and Next is Story Studio Network's flagship podcast, produced by our chief executive producer, Dave Trafford, and supported by our entire SSN team, including our senior producers, Becky Coles and Jen Hudson, our technical producer and audio editor, Mike Trutler. Jamie Nickerson is our production manager, and our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Also, I'm Erin Trafford, Queen of the Universe.
And that's all I have to say about that.
Okay, everybody, that's a wrap.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.